Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Raphael Cohen. I'm the events coordinator at the Berkeley Center for New Media, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, Unsettling Sound Technologies, Indigenous Sonic Sovereignty and Border Politics, with Professors Christina Leza and Trevor Reed. The Berkeley Center for New Media is an interdisciplinary research center that studies and shapes media transition and emergence from diverse perspectives. Through critical thinking and making, we cultivate technological equity and fairness in our classrooms, in our communities, and on the internet. Tonight's event is part of BCNM's History and Theory of New Media lecture series, which brings to campus leading humanities scholars working on issues of media transition and technological emergence. The series promotes new interdisciplinary approaches to questions about the uses, meanings, causes, and effects of rapid or dramatic shifts in techno-infrastructure, information management, and forms of mediated expression. The event is also presented as part of BCNM's Indigenous Technologies program, which engages questions of technology and new media in relation to global structures of indigeneity, settler colonialism, and genocide in the 21st century. Our Indigenous tech events and ongoing conversations with Indigenous scholars and communities aim to critically envision what a more just and sustainable technological future can look like. This summer, for the first time, we're offering a 6-week Indigenous Technologies online workshop where participants will have the opportunity to learn from prominent Indigenous scholars, artists, and practitioners addressing topics such as Indigenous representations in film, Indigenous futurisms, the land back and rematriation movements, environmentalism, and Indigenous food systems. I encourage you to visit newmedia.academy for more info and to sign up. And just a quick plug, if you enroll by March 15th, you're eligible for 50% off the workshop's total cost. So again, that's newmedia.academy for more info there. I also want to take a moment to thank our generous co-sponsors for tonight's event, the Department of Ethnic Studies and the Department of Art Practice. We are very grateful for your support in making tonight's event happen. I also want to invite everyone to participate by responding to tonight's lecture in the chat or in the Q&A portion, and ask that attendees help us maintain an inclusive, respectful, and harassment-free space. Attendees who violate any of these guidelines will be removed from the event and may be disallowed from future online events. If you're new to our events, please read our community agreements. We'll share a link to those in the chat in just a moment. I'd now like to turn it over to this evening's host and moderator, who will introduce our featured speakers. Sierra Edd is a PhD candidate in ethnic studies here at UC Berkeley. She is Zia Tlaoge, born for the Red House people, Kislechitni, and grew up in Durango, Colorado, Four Corners. Her research interests are in Indigenous gender and sexuality, culture, storytelling, futures/futurity, and digital media. She is a 2020 recipient of the Ford Pre-Doctoral Fellowship and a coordinator for both the Indigenous Sound Studies Working Group and BCNM's Indigenous Technologies Program. Sierra, please take it away.
Thank you, Raphael, and welcome to everyone. So before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to offer a land acknowledgement. We recognize that the BCNM is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chichoni-speaking Ohlone peoples, specifically the confederated villages of Lishan. The history of prolific technological development in this region has always depended on this land, and all of our technological infrastructures and activities take place on and in relation to this land. We commit to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing stewardship of this place by Ohlone people through building long-term reciprocity and relationships with tribal leaders and organizations. I also would like to acknowledge the current colonial violence taking place in Gaza. As an Indigenous scholar and coordinator of the Indigenous Technologies Program, this is something I cannot ignore. And now to introduce tonight's speakers, I'll begin with Christina Leza. She is an associate professor of anthropology and Indigenous studies at Colorado College. She is a linguistic anthropologist and Yoemi Chicana activist scholar whose scholarship focuses on Indigenous rights and lifeways, grassroots social justice movement, social discourse about race and ethnicity, and the US-Mexico border region. Her publications include Hip Hop is Resistance, Indigeneity in the US-Mexico Border, which is in the monograph, Music and Modernity Among First Peoples of North America, from Wesleyan University Press, and her ethnography, Divided Peoples, Policy, Activism, and Indigenous Identities in the US-Mexico Border, from the University of Arizona Press. Her work has appeared in numerous scholarly journals and media outlets, including NPR and PBS News Weekend. She's currently writing a textbook about the linguistics of racism titled The Language of Racism and Anti-Racism, from Routledge, and is co-editor of the forthcoming second edition of The Everyday Language of White Racism by Jane Hill with Jacqueline Messing and Barbara Meek. And then to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Trevor Reed is a professor of law in the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University, where he teaches courses in property, intellectual property, and in federal Indian law. Dr. Reed's research broadly explores the social impacts of intellectual property law on individuals and their communities. His current scholarship focuses on the linkages between creative production and Native American sovereignty. His recent publications include Restorative Justice for Indigenous Culture and Fair Use as Cultural Appropriation, and Indigenous Dignity and the Right to be Forgotten, with Sovereign Aesthetics, a new edited volume with Jessica Bissett Perea, forthcoming next year from Duke University Press. Dr. Reed is currently advancing community-partnered projects to assist Indigenous peoples as they protect and promote their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and intellectual properties by strategically drawing on tribal, federal, and international law. Welcome to you both. We'll begin with Christina presenting her work, and then we'll continue with Trevor presenting his work, and then we'll move into a moderated discussion with some time for Q&A and participation from the audience. So Christina, go ahead and take it away. I think you're on mute, Christina.
Okay. Let me. There we go. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I will start over again. I was thanking you, Sierra, as well as the Berkeley Center for New Media for the opportunity to present in this wonderful series. I'm just going to share my screen again here. And today I'll be talking about Indigenous hip hop on the US-Mexico border. And before I start talking about the two hip hop groups that I'll be discussing this evening, I just wanted to talk a bit about the Alianza Indígena Sin Fronteras. This is the grassroots indigenous group that I've collaborated with for many years in my work on the US-Mexico border. The group includes individual members from the Pasquayaqui, Tana'atam, Kokapa, Kickapoo nations, as well as Atham and Yaqui in Mexico, individual Mexica and Chicanx in the borderlands, and then also Hopi, Navajo, and Cherokee individuals who work in allyship with the Alianza to help protect the rights of Indigenous peoples whose homelands have been historically divided by the U.S.-Mexico border, as well as for the general protection of Indigenous peoples. The Alianza also works in partnership with other Indigenous groups, nations, such as the Kumeyaay and various Pai peoples and human peoples in the California Baja region and Arizona. So the first group that I'll be talking about today is Shining Soul. And when I first started working with Shining Soul in 2012, the group was a duo made up of a bronze candidate, or Franco Abre, and he is a Chicano identifying MC. And the second member of the group is Tohono Nation member Alex Soto, who is known as Liaison in his MC persona. And the group, as I continued to work with them, added a third member, becoming a trio. And that third member was Lawrence Martinez. His DJ name is DJ Reflection. And I'm just going to play plus just a bit of the song and video for No Mercy. And this is from the group's second album, Sonic Smash, just to give you a sense of the group's sound.
Like a native thing or a Mexican thing or whatever thing. It's people thing. We just happen to be who we're from. So that's why he's representing here, you know what I'm saying? So I'm going to represent back home too.
Immigration reform. I think we've seen enormous progress over the last month and a half.
But we don't love anybody who doesn't love us. We're non-violent with people who are non-violent with us.
I'm actually very optimistic that
but we are
when
not
they return,
non-violent with anyone
we'll see a bill
who is
ready to
violent with us.
move through the process.
The Border Patrol has more agents than ever. Nearly 22,000, 651 miles of fence, 125 airplanes, and 6 drones patrolling the Mexican frontier, making a successful illegal crossing more difficult than ever. In fact,
just because you post syrup on shit don't make it pancakes, you know what I'm saying?
We from that, home of the Si Se Puede, house of the insurrection, where 1070 meets 187, no love for brown complexion, silence is acquiescence, where non-violence protects and serves the 1%. We from that land of the man in the maze, but criminalization, militarization got our fists raised. Put them up, take action now, we revolutionary but indigenous, RBI's continuous, my hope until offenses, this means war, so I'll see you on the...
So I forgot to warn you that there would be middle fingers and some profanity. So it goes with hip hop. But I am going to move now to an image from the Tohono Nation. This is an image of the Tohono Nation's lands. And as you can see, the Tohono Nation is actually directly cut by the U.S.-Mexico border international line. Alex Soto, in his work with Shining Soul, primarily did focus in terms of talking about the border and the ways it impacts Indigenous peoples. Talked about this from his perspective as a Tohono Nation member. For those of you familiar with the Tohono Nation's situation, you'll know that they've experienced increasing numbers of border patrol on their nation's lands. In many other troubling types of border surveillance, and as a result of the increasing enforcement of the border, harassment and other forms of imposition on Tohono sovereignty have become a norm in the Tohono Nation's lands. And you see in the video that part of what Alex speaks about is his position as someone who is native to what he refers to as the land of the man in the maize, and that's a reference to the creator. But then the parallel of that is the statement by Franco Abre, which is that this is also the land of Si Se Puede, referring to the Mexican farm workers movement in the 1960s. And so it's really talking about these different, but still nevertheless united experience of colonized peoples on the US-Mexico border who have these shared experiences of a loss of their rights, of a shared sense of oppression as a result of settler colonialism in the region. Here are some images from border protests in 2010. At that time, there was state legislation that was designed both to block ethnic studies in the region, as well as to legalize essentially racial profiling. So SB 1070 was specifically legislation that made it mandatory for officers, as well as some other officials, to actually ask for proof of citizenship if individuals were identified as being potentially not U.S. Citizens, being in the United States without documentation. And so many activists rallied to talk about the problems of this for brown peoples in terms of their rights in the region. On the right, you see a protest poster that was very common in these types of protest rallies with the slogan, "We didn't cross the border crossed us." And this was something that you have heard in the Chicano rights movement for many decades, talking about the way in which the US-Mexico border created a situation in which those who were here in the borderland areas prior to the creation of that border suddenly became foreign and alien because of the establishment of that border, and then eventually the movement of that border over time. But you'll also hear this slogan used by Tohono O'odham Nation members talking about how the creation of the US-Mexico border dissected or cut across the traditional lands of the O'odham peoples, creating many difficulties for that nation. One issue, however, a source of conflict for those who are generally united in the US-Mexico border region around trying to help to maintain the rights of brown peoples to decolonize the region, is the issue of these different ways of conceptualizing indigeneity. And most of the tension revolves around the concept of Aslan. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this concept, this refers to the homelands of the Aztec peoples. It comes from Aztec origin narratives of a land from which the Aztec people migrated from, which is further north from their ultimate empire, which was established in central Mexico. And this was a concept that became very important during the period of the Chicano power movement, a way for detribalized Chicano peoples to be able to reconnect to their indigenous roots. So it became a symbol, something for people who could not reconnect to specific indigenous roots anymore because of the processes of colonization, separation from their original ancestries. It was something that allowed Chicano peoples to be able to reconnect with their indigenous cultures. But this has been an issue for many Native American or American Indian indigenous peoples, this idea of Aslan, because it is seen as something which really does not properly respect the origin stories of indigenous peoples in the region. So Alex Soto, for example, has stated that that's a concept that makes him uncomfortable, that he's not aware of that in his own origin story as a Tohono O'odham person, and definitely sees that as an issue in terms of thinking about the sovereign rights and a special place of indigenous peoples within the Southwest region. Bronze candidate or Franco Abre also has a similar problem as someone, even though he is connected to the Chicano movement, he has had issues with some of the ideologies in that movement as well. And he is very concerned about the framing of Aslan as something which is land-based. And he says that there are people in the movement who say, well, it's really sort of a symbol. It's to create a mental framework for thinking about decolonization, thinking about original roots. But nevertheless, for him, the framework is really based on conquest, and it is something which definitely from his perspective and from the perspective of many other Native peoples in the region, conceptualizes the taking over of these lands in a ways that does not respect the rights of the first peoples of those territories. So in my work, I began to look at this conflict between these two distinct forms of indigeneity, Native American or American Indian indigeneity, and Mexica, Chicanx, or detribalized indigeneity. These two related, overlapping forms of indigeneity, but really distinct in terms of the positionalities and experiences of those who identify as indigenous in these two distinctly different ways. Another group that I've looked at is Aslan Underground. And Aslan Underground is a group that is based in the Los Angeles area. And they are a punk, hip hop, kind of their own thing band. And they're made up of indigenous individuals who come from different indigenous backgrounds, including Comanche, Apache, Maswa, but all also identify in different ways as either Chicano or detribalized Latinx indigenous peoples. And sorry, I had an issue with the slide there. I'm just going to play just a bit of probably their most famous song. The reason why I became familiar with Aslan Underground is that if you're even mildly associated with the border rights movement in the border region, you will definitely at some point hear this song. And so I'll play a bit of it for you, for those of you who are not familiar with it.
So we want everybody in the house, if you're not afraid of love, loving yourself and loving the people and loving Mother Earth, we want you to put your fist in the air in the spirit of Zapatismo. We didn't cross the borders! Borders crossed us! We didn't cross the borders! The borders crossed us! We didn't cross the borders! Borders crossed us! Please, you guys can step back a little bit. DJ Metal Man's a little worried about his equipment.
So that's just a bit, that was from a live performance, and gives you a sense of the ways in which people have responded to the song. Again, one way in which people in the U.S.-Mexico border region who are concerned about their rights as brown peoples in the region have taken that banner slogan of "We didn't cross the border crossed us." So here I'm just highlighting some lyrics in that particular song by Aslan Underground that points to a main focus in the group's work, which is to point to the relationality, the relationships that exist between Native peoples in the United States and indigenous peoples in Latin America, and in particular, the relationship between those who identify as American Indian in the U.S. and those who identify as Mexica or Chicano. That these are all indigenous peoples with their own unique histories, but who all share the experience of colonialism and having been colonized, and ultimately pointing to the division of these peoples as a result of colonization. Another track which really tries to call for Indigenous peoples to think about the need and ability to work together in the process of decolonization is the song Indigena from the album Decolonize. And in this song, they quote Chicana activist Rocky Rodriguez, who once told the group, "Race is one thing and culture is another. Understand this, my sisters and brothers." The idea behind that particular statement was to really say that many Chicanx Mexica peoples get really caught up in this idea of race sort of ruining them historically, that they can no longer connect to their indigenous roots because of the ways in which they had ultimately become racialized through the process of colonialism, that they lost their indigeneity through that imposition of European blood into indigenous communities within the Americas, and also definitely connecting that to concepts of blood quantum, how that has become an important way in which many indigenous people conceptualize who is a real Native person. And she was really encouraging Mexica and Chicanx people to say, race is a made up thing. It's something that was created by colonialism to oppress indigenous peoples and to keep them in a certain place. But you have the ability to reconnect to your indigeneity by thinking about your own unique ancestry, the culture that you have inherited that does definitely have indigenous roots. And it's something to be cherished, and also something that you should embrace in connecting with other indigenous groups with their own unique ancestries and their own unique histories and their shared struggles of colonialism. Joe Peps and Yet Maswa, members of Aslan Underground, in a Riot documentary in 2015, talked about the role of music in healing. So a part of their larger project is really to create music that has the intention of healing the world from colonialism. And so here you have a quote from Yat that says that that music is really a prayer. It is a way to send out these healing frequencies to not only heal indigenous peoples of the Americas, but also to heal the larger world. And I'm going to circle back to Shining Soul now. The name Shining Soul itself is a reference to a very important symbol within the group, and it's the concept of soul shine. The idea of the shining soul is an elevated soul, a soul that has been elevated above oppression in order to really be one's true self and to be a decolonized self. So here you have some lines from the song that ends their first album, We Got This, and the song is called Shining. And in that song, you also have a mock radio DJ that concludes this track of the album, this last part of the album, and it's a callback to the intro of the album, which also includes this radio DJ asking people if they had a message to deliver to the world, what would that message be? And the message that Shining Soul chooses to deliver through this DJ voice is we need to respect each other, we need to love one another, and ultimately this is critical to this concept of soul shine. And so I just as I conclude some thoughts here, I do want to play just a little bit of the healing to try to get to a sense of what the band is going for in terms of their message about healing and how it relates to forming allyships between Indigenous peoples.
And always rap squads, the strike hard. I'm something like a lightning rod, about to embark like an Asgardian god. Cause beating a sledgehammer be two peas in a pod. Smashing the rods and the pipe dream besides. Cause they all fingers fuck like asphalt turf yards. And we the grassroots, cracking the boulevards. Cause the way we commute is by handling bars and peddling attributes. As far as wide bar, spreading that medicine and healing scars. It's the healing. It's the healing. It's the healing. It's the healing. It's the healing.
So in this particular This was one of the last, this is from the last album by Shining Soul. It is in the album Politics Aside, the group's third album. And here you do still see some of the imagery of the shine of the light, both in the what's going on sonically within that particular song, what's going on with the lyrics. But you also see the concept of struggle in some of these lyrics, including those that begin the song by Bronze Candidate, but then also in particular through Liaison's lyrics, where you begin to see some much more intense kind of violent imagery. He actually conceptualizes himself at one point as Rick Grimes, you know, like striking at zombies, and you know, lightning rod, a sledgehammer, trying to strike out to really show that even though the goal is soulshine and the goal is to decolonize and find healing, that right now, because of settler colonialism, the ground really isn't welcoming to that, and that it is an intense struggle. It's something that requires intensity on the part of those who are seeking this healing. Franco Abre similarly states about the song, I never said decolonize ever in my music, but basically that was the focus. We all need healing, whatever that looks like to you, but ultimately saying that this, even though the healing sounds lovely and wonderful, ultimately it's not something that's always going to be easy, that there is going to be a significant amount of struggle in this. And just in conclusion, I wanted to point to a different group that many of you have heard of. This is Hallucination, previously known as a tribe called Red. And hallucination is really a conceptual, it comes from the Indigenous activist, poet, musician, John Trudell, and his conceptualization of a nation of people who would be allied with each other in order to recover their indigeneity and to work against the forces of settler colonialism. And hallucination definitely sees this concept of identity as being central to this struggle, saying that Indigenous people do need to define their identity on their own terms. And if you share this vision, then you are already a part of the hallucination. So the hallucination too, you see, much like the other groups that we have talked about today on the US-Mexico border, are really thinking in terms of, you know, how can we move past the racial logics of colonialism in thinking about indigeneity in order to better see ourselves for who we really are, and also in order to unite with each other for our own sovereignty and our own movement. Okay, so that's all I have. I will go ahead and stop the share.
Thank you, Christina. And just a quick note for the audience. If you have any questions for Christina and Trevor, feel free to use the Q&A box and I will see them and ask at the end. And now we'll transition over to Trevor. So yeah, go ahead.
All right, let me get set up here real quick. Okay. Well, first of all, I also want to thank the Berkeley Center for New Media, including Raphael and Sierra, for their generous invitation to speak with you all tonight. And I also want to acknowledge the Akima O'odham Nation, whose lands I'm broadcasting from today. I also wanted to thank my collaborators at the Hopi Tribe. We've been involved in a project for several years now, since 2008, to return hundreds of recordings from archives around the world back to the Hopi people, along with their intellectual property rights. And so the work that I'm going to share tonight is really a direct outgrowth of this project. I also want to thank Christina for that fantastic presentation. It's such a pleasure to be able to work with Christina and also some of her collaborators on that project. And they're also involved in the shaping of the project that I'm talking about tonight. Let me start out with the problem. So there are literally thousands, if not millions, of Indigenous voices, images, likenesses, other kinds of Indigenous expression that have been captured and what I would call incarcerated in institutional archives like the ones I have listed here. This is just a brief tally of Indigenous voices and other materials in major institutions. We don't have a central repository or any sort of a registry like we have for copyrights and trademarks, but we do have a list of how many of these materials are in institutional archives. It's impossible to generalize, of course, but we know based on the literature that a large number of these voices, expressions, representations of our ancestors are protected, right, by our traditional tribal laws, our protocols, our standards of care, and other kinds of norms. We also know that many, if not most, of the materials that were acquired by these institutions violate these kinds of laws and protocols and standards of care. Angela Riley, a legal scholar at UCLA, has explained in a recent article that while nearly every tribal nation has some sort of law or protocol or standard that governs the sharing of voices and ancestors and cultural expressions, we now have even 50 tribal nations that have written those laws and have them available to the public now so that people can actually look at them and know what they're supposed to do when it comes to Indigenous voices and other kinds of expression. At the same time, we also know that most institutions will follow copyright and other kinds of intellectual property laws, but they don't follow our tribal laws. They don't follow our protocols or abide by our standards. It's not that there's anything inherently inferior about our laws. There's not even a legal reason why they don't follow our laws. Tribes are separate sovereigns. They're not generally subject to the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, for example. Copyright laws are even silent about whether or not they preempt tribal laws. It's just institutions don't do it because, frankly, they don't know tribal law. And even if they did, they don't think that they're enforceable. So what I want to talk about tonight, actually, before I get to that, what I want to talk about tonight isn't really the intricacies of the law as it applies to these kinds of materials. What I want to talk about actually is something a little bit deeper. And it goes to the technologies that these materials are embedded in. What I want to talk about is this unchecked settler drive to record and preserve Indigenous voices. And the argument that I want to make is that that's largely to blame for the continued incarceration of our ancestors and their representations. And the result is pretty devastating, right? Preservation can be extremely toxic when it's not handled according to Indigenous standards of care, and it's instead handled according to settler sensibilities. The argument that I want to make here is that archives and other holders of Indigenous voices need to look at Indigenous standards of care in the treatment of ancestral voices. All right, so let me share a story that comes from my experiences working out at Hopi with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. As you can imagine, for a long time, European settlers have been filling their archives with all sorts of things from our tribal lands and, of course, from many tribal nations around the country. But in the mid-1990s, after the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed, and also the Hopi tribe had passed its own laws demanding the return of Hopi remains and artifacts and knowledge, the tribe actually started sending out letters to museums and other institutions demanding that these materials be brought back home, that our ancestors and their voices and their representations be back in our hands. But to the surprise of the tribe, package after package started arriving, and they started filling the cubicles to our tribal offices to overflowing. And on one occasion, the tribe actually received some really important ritual items that our ceremonial leaders were looking forward to making use of in an upcoming ceremony. But, after the ceremonial performers started using the materials, they started getting sick with rashes and sores appearing all over where these materials had come in contact with their bodies. And what we learned from our medical folks out on the reservation is that much to everybody's horror, the items had been preserved with arsenic, which, while preserving the life of these materials, had actually poisoned the very people for whom the objects had been created. Now, just like preservation can poison physical materials, there are real dangers in continuing to preserve and make accessible our ancestors' voices in settler archives. And there might be risks even with returning and recirculating these materials uncritically. They're really hybrids of settler modes of preservation and also Indigenous generative power. I guess that's what I would call it. These recorded Indigenous voices in some contexts actually take on a heightened degree of toxicity. So in my collaborations with folks on tribal lands, we've seen at least 3 ways in which archived sound, preserved sound can become toxic. When voices are preserved in forms that are transferable outside of the protection of our traditional protocols, they can really cause harm to people. One of our elders, Leonard Talaswaima, explained at a recent presentation that some of the songs, when people perform them, if they don't know the sacredness of them, they can actually become really dangerous. We call them utihihi. They should be handled with care, and only people that should handle them should do that. They have what we would call a metaphorical whip, right? A wuvapi, and anything that happens to you because your misuse of those songs is a result of that, right? Even though you might hear somebody authorized perform these songs, you shouldn't perform them. And there are health consequences for that. Another reason is that songs, when they're recorded, can easily become exclusive property, especially under our copyright laws in the United States. And they become subject to individual self-interest and exclusion, rather than being part of an integral network of relationships. In the Hopi mode of song ownership, it's primarily based on inclusion and collective benefit, not necessarily on exclusion and self-interest. The last thing that I want to talk about, and I want to spend a little bit more time on, is this notion of anonymous care. When settler institutions care anonymously without concern for the lives of the voices that they're actually holding on to. Yes, these materials, once they're preserved, allow our people following centuries of colonization to rebuild their communities and our languages and our modes of relation. But what I argue is that when they're in the control of settler archives, when they're forced to either live or die according to the preservationist or the archivist, that all too often takes on a non-Indigenous biopolitics. And what do I mean? Well, let me harken back to a book written in 2014 by a woman named Lisa Stevenson called Life Beside Itself. In this book, she talks about the difference between Inuit modes of care and the anonymous care of the Canadian bureaucracy. So in this book, she shows how governmental health programs take a lot of care to number and organize Inuit people that are sick with tuberculosis, but then they disappear them to sanatoria far off, hundreds of miles away. She also looks at suicide prevention hotlines created for Indigenous people that instruct volunteers to listen really intently to Inuit people's suicide plans. But then they instruct all of the professionals that operate these not to develop any kind of personal relationships with the people on the other end of the line. It's kind of the irony, right, of the settler government's effort to impersonally care about Native lives, really as an exercise in population management. And I think Stevenson points out that really Canada only cares to the extent that it can maintain biopower over Indigenous lives. This, of course, can be extended into the archive. And I think media studies scholar Jonathan Stern has done a great job of pointing this out. He said that sound recording preserves the exteriority of the voice, but it completely transforms its interiority. Stern, I think, frames field recording as this illusion, right? It seems like it's alive, but really what the recordist wants to hear is what gets recorded. Erica Brady talks about how recording of Indigenous peoples is a mechanical means of bronzing or freezing Native voices into these discrete aesthetic facts that can substitute at some point for Indigenous people themselves. So this is really the challenge, right? This anonymous care. We can certainly contrast Indigenous modes of care, particularly over the body and of the voice and of the breath, to these kinds of bureaucratic ways of caring that we might see in archives. I'll just gloss over this just briefly, but just to mention that biopolitics is certainly a train of thought that comes from Michel Foucault's work, looking at how governments decide what lives and what doesn't. But let me move on and talk a little bit about how how our traditional principles view the sound of the voice. In the Hopi context, death doesn't really mark one's existence from present to past. A scholar, Mary Black, also a Hopi woman, she talks about life and death as analogized to the growth of corn plants. After years of corn are harvested, the stalks of corn actually die, right? It becomes katungu or lifeless and without sona or substance. And in death, our breath, or a hikwasi, continues. It's anuti, or it's becoming perfected. And while the seeds go on to generate new plants in different times and places, those corn stalks, they stay in the ground, and we lay them down and we let them decay. They're not uprooted. They actually become a guide for where we plant the next year, and they serve as a mulch that keeps the water and the nutrients in the ground into the future. Now, if we compare that to human lives, I think the bodies of the dead are traditionally not preserved. We're actually allowed to decay. We burn our dead's belongings. We don't speak their names after a certain period of time. Others take on our responsibilities. And we free our ancestors from their bindings to this world so they can keep doing their work in other times and places. We're really supposed to let them go. And this was pointed out to me by DJ Dawatio, a Hopi elder who actually runs a radio show on KUYI Hopi Radio. Dawatio, he airs about 25 of the songs we've been repatriating back to the tribe. And I remember one time we were sitting around and I was talking to him about, why does he play all these old songs on the radio? Why would people actually be interested in old songs? It was interesting. He explained to me, some people might say these are just old songs, but that's not really how they are for us. They're always present. So when old recordings are played, he says they might have somebody's voices on them from the past, and that might make them interesting historically, but to listeners, at least in the Hopi way, the songs themselves continue to do what they're meant to do, right? They continue on performing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, while there are times when Hopi culture should be remembered and recorded, like Dawatio, he continues to perform them and they continue to do their function, there's also times when Hopi culture is supposed to be forgotten. And the Pueblo Revolt and the destruction of the village of Awa'ovi is one really difficult example of this. I don't know if everybody knows the history of the Pueblo Revolt, but on August 10th, 1680, the indigenous peoples of the Southwest collectively rose up against the Spanish, and we retook our territories. A network of runners with knowledge of the plan carried knotted ropes tracking the days until this kind of coordinated rebellion would take place. And in nearly all of the indigenous villages throughout Mexico and now, New Mexico and Arizona, present-day New Mexico and Arizona, Spanish Catholic priests were either executed or they fled after being tipped off. Spanish churches and palaces were looted and burned, and the Hopi villages of Oraivi and Awa'ovi, the Catholic churches were destroyed, and 3 Franciscan priests actually were executed. So, Spanish Catholicism and its brutality had been forcibly erased from our lands. Now, 20 years later, in the midst of kind of this Hopi cultural revitalization, after the occupation by the Spanish, some Pueblo communities actually started practicing Catholicism again. And as one of our elders and vice chairman, Elgin Joshvema, explained in a 2002 interview, Catholic priests, actually, they were invited by one of the villages. They started to reconstruct the remains of their church and started to reconstruct their power there. And sometime between 1700 and 1701, leaders from many of our villages organized and carried out a complete destruction of the Hopi village of Awa'ovi. Most of the men were killed, and many of the women and children were removed to other villages. And, the forced erasure again of the dogma and the rituals and the abusive practices of Spanish Catholicism from Hopi memory was permanent, and it was intentional, and it was carried out by Hopi authority. Another example of forgetting involves this gentleman, K.T. Johnson, in 1927. He was a Hopi priest that converted to the Mennonite religion, one of our last members of the Bow clan. And this clan was one of the most powerful at Hopi, held ownership over important ceremonies. And Johnson's position actually made him an heir to the village leadership. But with dwindling numbers and Johnson's conversion, the clan hadn't performed its ceremonies much in the years preceding. So at one point, the Bow clan altar actually was stolen from Mr. Johnson by his rivals, who were trying to reclaim and revitalize the ceremony. And, had they been successful, maybe that would have changed the course of the village, right, and of this clan. But in 1927, K.T. Johnson's aunt, the last matriarch of his clan, passed away. And for him, that meant that the fire of his clan went out. And not long after that, with a Mennonite missionary following him, he approached those leaders who had stolen the altar, and they were literally in the process of conducting a ceremony, and he took the objects back so that he could burn them. Now, the rivals initially resisted, but they relented and they recognized Johnson's legitimacy as the one rightfully authorized to control these materials. And once he was in possession of them, Johnson piled them up, he poured gas on the pile, and then he asked the local young man to light the match. Now, some scholars have said, oh, well, this is, of course, the effects of settler colonialism. Johnson was basically taken over by this Western faith, and that's why he did what he did. But according to Johnson's account, it was different, right? He was intent on fulfilling Hopi prophecies about the development of Hopi culture along this predetermined progression, which necessarily included the death of certain things so that others can develop and live. The ceremonies have gone out of existence, that's true, but I've also witnessed how bits of ceremonies, words, phrases, affects, they become references in new songs which are remembered and circulated. And through repetition, they become meaningful as they lose their temporality, but they retain their effects. Now, anyone who's made a regrettable tweet or a Facebook post knows the value of forgetting, right? And I don't want to trivialize what I've just been talking about, but I think this is a universal principle, right? A scholar, Victor Mayer Schoenberger, writes, if we had to worry that information about us could be remembered for longer than we live, would we still share our views on things? Would we share our personal experiences? Would we make political comments? Or would we self-censor, right? If we knew that everything we said was going to last forever, we might change what we say, right? We might be different people. The question that I want to pose here is that, when Indigenous voices and other forms of cultural data are made to live under the preservation apparatus of the settler state, I'm pretty certain that Indigenous sovereignty is diminished significantly. So my argument here is that the care of Indigenous voices has to be, in the first instance, in the hands of Indigenous peoples, not in settler governments. Now, this idea that Indigenous people should have the right to erase what's in the archive resonates in some ways with the European Union's recently General Data Protection Regulation. This was amended in 2016. And essentially what this does is it requires big data corporations like Google and Facebook and Apple and Amazon to actually erase somebody's data under certain conditions upon request, right? So governments in several parts of the world have now established a policy like this that ensures forgetfulness and erasure of corporate memory so that individuals can have their autonomy back, right? So at the same time, even with the passage of this regulation, a lot of folks in the European Union and here in the United States put a lot of pressure against this. Social media corporations, journalists, historians were all super worried that, this right to be forgotten would be a violation of our freedom of speech, right? And so they actually created carve-outs for archivists to be able to continue to preserve things. Nowadays, there in California, you have the California Consumer Privacy Act, which similarly allows you to erase data upon request. However, it also has a freedom of speech carve-out, right? The argument I want to make here is that we should have a similar right for Indigenous peoples, right? Upholding Indigenous dignity necessitates having a tribal government or at least a tribal community's right to regulate data within their territory, to protect Indigenous people from exploitative practices of the nation state or of archives or of folks that have recorded our information, and when necessary, demand that those be erased or at least given back and put under our control. One of Indigenous sovereignty's core attributes, I argue, is the ability to care for the voices of our ancestors, past, present, and future. This certainly includes the ability of our communities to decide the appropriate preservation techniques and the possibilities of circulation for these materials. But it certainly includes the rights of our people to exclude the settler state from using and accessing our voices and our images and our ancestors, and the right for us to care for these materials and, if necessary, demand their destruction. So that's my argument. Would love to hear your thoughts and feedback, but hopefully, we'll see some action on this in the coming years. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Trevor. And thank you also, Lisa, for both of your really like insightful and very interesting presentations. So now I will invite the participants to offer any questions they have in using the Q&A function on Zoom. And in the meantime, I can ask a couple of questions that I had jotted down while listening. And I have a couple questions actually for both of you to respond to kind of like have yeah, like a comparative or just like similarities amongst your presentations. So the first is given that this talk is kind of engaged with the topic of Indigenous music and sound or technologies generally, and you kind of have both given different approaches to technologies, whether in relation to Indigenous uses or, you know, the nation state or colonial uses of technologies. I'm interested in the uses of sovereignty within sound and music or legal settings, and why it's important to sort of situate sovereignty within tribal contexts or local contexts of different like ethnic groups, and what are the dangers of decontextualizing or even like metaphoricizing, you know, Indigenous sovereignty in certain contexts.
Trevor and I are both trying to figure out who should say something first. So I think, well, I mean, I think in terms of the legal realm, I think Trevor can speak much better to that issue than I can. But I mean, one thing that the question makes me think of is the accessibility of the music that is being produced by Indigenous groups like Aslan Underground and Shining Soul. One of the things that came up in my conversations with the two groups was the issue of cultural appropriation. And Aslan Underground in particular was very conscious of the ways in which recordings can be accessed and used by other artists for their own purposes. And something that they came to realize in borrowing from recordings by Indigenous artists was that they did in fact, even though they saw it initially as a way of connecting with other Indigenous musicians, artists, other Indigenous traditions, and this is still something that they attempt to do, they realized that they needed to learn the appropriate protocols that were specific to the communities that they hoped to borrow from, and that they needed to forge relationships so that if they made mistakes, they could somehow use that as a way to further a relationship, to learn from that in their own process of decolonizing and forging better allyships with different Indigenous groups. And one thing that I have found really interesting sort of theoretically in terms of the ways in which Indigenous musicians are asserting their sovereignty is that they are choosing to generally make their music very available. So Shining Soul, for instance, you can hear any of their music through Bandcamp. They have many videos that they've made online. Aslan Underground also makes its music relatively available through channels like YouTube. And so this is a way in which they can have a voice, and it's a voice that can exist as long as the internet exists. One assumes it can exist in perpetuity, or if people extract those music files, but the video and audio files, it can live on even if the internet were to go away. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that anyone should do whatever they want with them just because they can gain access to them, that there should still be that sort of set of ethics in place that is really thinking about, okay, what are protocols? What are appropriate ways to use music so that this is a way of connecting to those who are creating these art forms, creating these messages in order to further the message and in order to create new messages together. So that was something that I thought of as Trevor was speaking, in terms of thinking about, yes, it's wonderful that we have these records that help to archive these voices, but at the same time, there still needs to be some control over that. That if we want, if sovereignty needs to be represented through those voices, then you still need to have the assertion of the voice of those creators. And if that voice can no longer be asserted, then maybe those are reasons for the descendants of those voices to put those voices to rest.
Yeah, and I would just build off of that, what Christina said. I totally agree. And, part of the project that I'm working on with Alex Soto right now is about thinking about what an Indigenous archive looks like. How do you think about the lifespan of an ancestral voice? And it is interesting to meet with communities and see what they envision. How are these materials? What is their nature as an archival object? And how can we change that to better reflect what the community wants to have happen for those things long term? But I did want to kind of jump into the question a little bit, Sierra, that you mentioned about, what happens when we turn these into metaphors, right? When we transform sovereignty into, a metaphor in a different realm. And I think law is 100% guilty of this, right? It's kind of like the prime space to metaphorize, I don't know, is that an actual word? To convert sovereignty into a metaphor. And that's been one of the problems, is that, in our Western system, we look at Indigenous ceremony and we convert it into property, right? Because that's kind of how we think about sound and expression. We think about it as a kind of a property that can be commodified and bought and sold. But the problem is that once we do that, we change the nature of what Indigenous sound does. And in this case, when an archivist, a standard archival operation gets a hold of Indigenous sound, they convert it into like a sonic fact, right? It's all of a sudden it's an object as opposed to like a living node of connection between people and the land and other things in the environment. And so it just changes its nature. And I think that's one of the big dangers of these kinds of metaphors and symbolizing Indigenous sovereignty in different ways. It can also be really important, right? How do you convert, or how do you convey what our sovereignty is without using a metaphor? It's so expansive, without using some sort of way to teach it to people. But we have to be super careful and cautious. So anyway, that would be my other 2 cents on it.
Thank you, Trevor. And as you were talking, I was just thinking about the idea of translation in terms of like tribal epistemology and legal systems into the US, or like, what is recognized in international law, national law, and things like that. I guess kind of going off of that, I was wondering, you mentioned ownership and also addressed property law. Can you kind of break it down? What are the differences between, from your research with folks from the tribal community, that how is their understanding of property and ownership different from more, colloquial uses of property law or intellectual law?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and thank you for the question. I'm just going to see, I wonder if I actually have a slide that might be helpful here. Let me just scroll down here and see if I've got anything on this topic. Yeah, actually. Okay, here we go. All right, so I'm going to share my screen one more time. Sorry about that. So one of the interesting experiences we've had working at Hopi on the repatriation project has been looking at Hopi ways of owning. And one of the challenges with this has been trying to kind of like destabilize our notions of what ownership is. When I got to Hopi, one of the first things that I thought was, okay, I'm just going to go to a meeting of elders, our cultural leaders, and I'm just going to ask them who owns these recordings. And then we're going to bring them back and give them to whoever the owner is, right? And as you can imagine, just didn't work, right? That's not, certainly tribes are not homogenous groups of people that everybody agrees. But what we learned as we've worked and spent time with different stakeholders in our community, ranging from high school students all the way to various, matriarchal groups to our cultural leaders, is that there are actually some principles of Hopi protocol and law and standards of care that we didn't really understand until we really sat down and talked with people. So, for example, some of our public dance songs are shared under a principle that we would call nasimokyata or tuat akmongvistote, which basically means, it's like you can use material you hear so long as you don't do it for personal profit, and you also perform it according to our local protocols, right? So as long as it's not being used for selfish purposes, it's being performed with a good heart, you actually have the right to be able to use material that you hear in certain contexts, right? Other stuff is very restricted, right? Other stuff, there are principles that say, hey, only an authorized leader can make use of this. And so, we had to learn a whole different language. In intellectual property law, like copyright, it basically says whoever creates it owns it, and they have the right to reproduce it and distribute it and to stream it and to perform it to the public and all of those things. And then we have carve-outs for fair use, right? Anyone can use it if they're doing it for educational purposes, and it's not going to cost anybody, right? In our Hopi way, we don't really have a fair use. But we do have an inclusive culture around sharing songs and sound, except for those materials that contain very safeguarded knowledge, and then those are restricted. So it just required a totally different way of looking at the law and thinking through it through a Hopi lens. But getting back to your question again, if we hadn't questioned what these things are, if we hadn't started with this ontological question of what is it that we're hearing, we probably wouldn't have ever learned our Hopi intellectual property system. And so I think all tribal nations have a way of looking at this material, and we just need to step back and allow our Indigenous peoples to lead.
Thank you for that, Trevor. And I wanted to ask a question for Christina about your presentation kind of presented some really interesting case studies or examples of Indigenous and Chicanx collaborations in music form, especially thinking about the idea of layered cultures or collaboration rather than kind of static cultures. So I was interested in the idea of, themes of the border and specifically, other terms that scholars have used within literary settings or literary examples of remapping. So do you think that kind of was happening within your research of interviewing the artists, where they kind of had their own understandings and orientations to the border zones and territories and stories in relation to the land? Did that theme of remapping come up?
The theme of remapping did come up in reference to from the perspective of specific Indigenous nations, for example, the Tana'atham Nation or the Yaqui Nation, in terms of thinking about what those lands, what the territories looked like prior to colonization, prior to the creation of what many Indigenous peoples on the U.S.-Mexico border and on the northern border refer to as these imaginary lines or arbitrary lines that were created by nation states. So thinking about how one could conceptualize the landscape from that Indigenous perspective that was absent of these lines that you now necessarily have to see cutting across these territories and representations in order to represent certain notions of rights related to citizenship in specific territories. And whether we're talking about specific districts within an Indigenous nation, or we're talking about rights connected to a citizenship identity within a specific nation state. And I also heard conceptualizations of sort of thinking about ways of thinking from that much more traditional Indigenous perspective of landscape, but also in terms of thinking about how the landscape was now changing as a result of the US-Mexico border and its enforcement. So environmental damage that was being done, the necessity of really beginning to talk about all of those traditional resources, those special places for Indigenous peoples. They needed to somehow be remembered in some form as those particular resources and spaces were being threatened by various forms of border enforcement construction, whether that was from a wall that was being constructed, or from surveillance towers that were being constructed, or just sort of the regular movement of border patrol along the US-Mexico border, thinking about the ways in which you could create maps to think about different ways of conceptualizing landscapes that were still in keeping with traditional understandings of the landscape, but knowing that these places were going to be they're rapidly becoming more and more different because of the nature of international border enforcement. And I think for some, it was thinking about an actual literal map, sort of creating these visual maps that could help to represent these places as the landscapes changed from a more traditional Indigenous perspective. And for others, it could be things like artistic representations, or just ways of sharing narratives about these places in order to create these understandings of the landscape as it rapidly changed.
Thank you. All right, so we have a couple questions from the audience. So there's a question for each Christina and Trevor. So I'll start with first question for Christina. This is from Ever Reyes. I'm interested in the similarities of Aslan Underground and Rage Against the Machine, who had a song on their debut album calling for the release of Leonard Peltier, while quoting Malcolm X, "Anger is a gift," titled Freedom. Could you speak about this connection between Indigenous Chicanics and Black hip hop artists? So yeah, kind of like, I guess, across cultural movements.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the areas that I am exploring is the ways in which Indigenous hip hop artists see themselves as being connected to Black hip hop artists. And certainly the issue of cultural appropriation has come up, not by the Indigenous artists themselves necessarily. Mostly their concerns about of appropriation are about appropriation of their own communities' resources, as well as concerns about appropriating from other Indigenous communities. But I myself, in talking about Indigenous hip hop, have heard, in particular from Black scholars, expressing a concern about the use of a Black cultural resource in the form of hip hop, as well as other connected musical genres such as soul music or R&B. And so I went back to Indigenous artists to talk to them. How do you feel about this idea of appropriation, or how do you see yourself as being connected to the African diaspora? And a lot of it goes back to sort of seeing inspiration in hip hop as a form of protest music, that this is something that spoke to the types of racial oppression that all peoples of color were experiencing in the United States, that obviously the position of Black peoples in the US was something unique in terms of the specific histories of Black peoples, the history of enslavement in the United States. But nevertheless, the Indigenous artists that I spoke to about this did say that they saw this as something that was really connecting to them on a personal level in terms of thinking about the ways in which they had experienced racialization and oppression. And hip hop was something that seemed to speak to something really critically important in terms of this sort of liberation voice, this form that was available to them because of the ingenuity and art of Black musicians. And so seeing that as a gift that could be taken and used on their own, but again, with the idea that they needed to respect the roots of where that came from, and understanding that it's not something that's really meant to be exploited in the way that many many white artists and music industries have exploited Black culture. That it comes from a different place from Indigenous artists, because it is the idea of decolonizing. And decolonizing is not just for Indigenous peoples, it's also for other peoples who have suffered through colonization. And so certainly thinking about the ways in which Black peoples have been historically oppressed in the United States and also across the globe as a process of colonialism is something that the Indigenous artists keep in mind. Shining Soul does a lot of shout outs to specific Black artists that they have found inspired them in terms of the creation of their own messages within their music. Aslan Underground doesn't so much do this type of citation in their musical creations, but they've spoken certainly about the importance of being an allyship with other people of color. They have one song called Black Lives Matter, which they created as a way of demonstrating allyship with those in the African diaspora following the initial development of the Black Lives Matter movement. And that track first came out shortly after the murder of George Floyd, as a way of saying that, you know, our struggles are different, but they are connected to each other, and we need to support each other in this work of decolonization and in seeking justice for people of color.
Thank you. All right, and then we have the second question for Trevor, who can respond, and I'll just read it out really quick. This is also from Ever. I'm interested in your thoughts about the field of ethnomusicology. In some way, our field is fundamentally built off of the recordings and archiving of Indigenous materials by settler listeners. It feels like your intervention invokes a reinventing of the field, shifting from music and sound hunters to something else. How do we reconcile the issues of the field while making sure not to make the same mistakes?
Well, isn't that the perfect question, right? I think a lot of us in the field of ethnomusicology, especially those that work with Indigenous communities, colonized communities, we're wondering the same thing, right? What comes next? Is this really, is this everything that we have? What is the legacy that we get to build on? Do we just kind of ignore the past and move forward? Do we reshape the field at this point, now that we've had a lot of really important interventions that have happened in recent years? You know, I can say that, you know, for one, it's absolutely correct, right? The field is built off of recordings of Indigenous materials, and settler listeners, settler, you know, field workers. That's kind of that was the paradigm, and that's where most of the field's methods and practices had come from. And so there's that piece, right? In the same way that the settler nation has been built from Indigenous lands and the appropriation of Indigenous resources, we have this intellectual community that's been generated from the intellectual and creative contributions of Indigenous peoples that have effectively been cordoned off, converted into property, and then have become the commodity of the field. And that legacy continues on today. So the question is, nowadays we have the land back movement and we have a lot of social justice around this. What's stopping us from doing something like sound back, returning sound back to, the folks that that have the sovereignty over this material already and that have exercised that and know how to care for it appropriately. So I think that's one of the interventions that I'm hoping to make in this paper, right, is that this material really should go back to the folks that can govern it appropriately. But I think there's something more fundamental to Ever's question here too, which is, what about our field? What's left once we take out extraction and appropriation? One of the things that I advocate for is maybe retiring the single author ethnography as kind of the core of our field. This notion that one person can go in and understand the nature of an entire community, I think is something that, has been dismantled quite a bit in the work of folks like Christina, right, who are partnering and really truly collaborating with all of her collaborators and interlocutors, right, transforming it into just kind of one person's gaze into kind of a partnership. And I think that perhaps is the next step in a lot of the work that we do, is to continue to reduce the single, the individualism of it, and then start to build on relations and connections. That would be my way of indigenizing the field, right? To think about ways that we can not do this work in a way that separates us off and takes the sound out and repurposes it, but actually utilizes the relationships there and grows from the ground up. But I think there's a lot to think about, right? What could ethnomusicology be going forward? Does it have to be the kind of field that it is now? Could it turn into something different? And I think it's not just my ideas on this. I'd actually love to hear everybody's ideas on this, including Sierra, who I think is somebody who has lots of great thoughts on this topic. I don't know, Sierra, do you want to talk to that at all?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think but like listening to both of your talks, I made a note of how both of you were speaking about Indigenous music as kind of resisting this aesthetic fact or object, whether, in the museum as an artifact or being palatable for the consumers. And I know, Christina, you mentioned how Indigenous artists, which I've also found in my own research, have kind of resisted the commercial route within music of kind of going mainstream, which, is a kind of seeking investment in the like industry standards, which are, highly commercial and have levels of tourism when it comes to Indigenous objects that is both racialized and gendered, in terms of like how the settler, views and sees indigeneity as desirable in certain moments, but also criminal in other senses, especially in the border zone. So I think I feel like in general, the movement in the field is going toward like what you're speaking toward, Trevor. And I think like it comes down to like, the tribal specificity and different ways Indigenous peoples are view their music and their culture, and also enact their own types of sovereignty and politics in a diverse way, which is why I appreciate like Christina speaking to the complexities of indigeneity from like Chicanx perspectives, as well as tribal North American context, which is like different, but I feel like they can coexist. And I think that's the point of like both of your talks. So yeah, but I guess, is there anything else you'd like to add, Christina?
To that question, Yeah, I mean, I'm not technically an ethnomusicologist, so I'm not sure how much I can speak to where the field should be going, but I can say that in terms of where I think anthropology should be going, and I think it's very similar in terms of this sort of ethnographic focus on what is being produced by a community of ethnomusicology, obviously with the more specific focus on music. I do feel that the focus should be on what Trevor refers to, that for collaboration, moving away from this idea that it's just the lone ethnographer going in and making sense out of what it is that they're observing, because that's never been the case. That we've pretended that that's the case, but we've always existed in collaboration. But we've in the process of trying to make it a sole voice type of academic production, we've definitely gone through the process of suppressing voices and also not properly giving credit to individuals who should be receiving credit for the intellectual ideas that emerge from our work. And so I definitely feel that that is the direction that we should be moving into, and as a part of that, thinking about there a shift in our thinking about what the data should be. So if we're moving away from access to archives, if we're moving away from this sort of classic ethnographic model of going to a community for a set period of time and somehow learning everything you need to know about the thing that you're studying during that set period of time, you do need to think longer range and in terms of the different types of conversations that you have with the people that you're collaborating with, and in order to really get a unique and much more rich type of ethnographic analysis, then I think is really possible in the ways in which we have seen ethnographic work be done, in whether that's in anthropology or ethnomusicology or any other field that's engaged in ethnographic work.
Thank you. And it looks like we have one more question that I will read, and both of you can respond to it. So Daniel writes, Dr. Leza and Dr. Trevor Reed both have discussed this, but I want to hear, but what I hear from this is that is an imperative, that it is imperative for us to consider that whenever one engages in an interlocutor's content, knowledge, symbols, and artifacts, that there may be ontological differences around what Euro-America has recognized as, quote, intellectual property, vis-a-vis knowledge that ought to be shared. Moreover, there may be different considerations for who are the stakeholders around the artifacts or music content that could be stored, modified, and reproduced. With this in mind, I'm curious to learn more about how one could better communicate this aspect of differences in our day-to-day. Anecdotally, I've noticed online a resurgence of rhetoric that brusquely chastises the justifiably valid politics around anti-cultural appropriation viewpoints. And as someone mentioned earlier regarding ethnomusicology, I wonder how one could contextualize the fact that there are different value systems around knowledge that may not lend themselves to the public domain.
Trevor, would you like to tackle that question first?
I think it's a great question. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there and try to think through this kind of on the spot. Yeah, I think you're right. There are a lot of challenges when it comes to looking at what it is that we're interfacing with, whether it's somebody's songs or whether it's, archival materials or images or social media posts or whatever it is, right? Trying to understand them as something other than intellectual property, even though we might be trained in this field to kind of recognize that as valuable data or valuable, something of value or a commodity in our field. And so, the question is, how do we deal with this, especially in an environment now where folks are kind of spewing anti-cultural appropriation rhetoric, and maybe even saying, hey, by leading the charge against cultural appropriation, you're actually kind of diminishing the public domain, right? Kind of making this argument that it's a zero-sum game, that because Indigenous peoples perhaps want to protect culture, then they're basically robbing the rest of us of what we could benefit from in terms of, gaining insights from humanity. And we hear a lot of that these days, right? That, why should we lock up this, or why should we why should we get rid of offensive mascots or things like that, right? It's just expression. And I think the challenge with that, and what I often tell my students as I'm trying to explain this in our intellectual property classes, is that there's some real value in having these diverse perspectives of what intellectual property is, or what creativity or expression is. Because sometimes there are things that you can do with expression and intellectual property in one system that you can't do in another. This notion that you can have relationships through sound with the environment, or with other non-humans, or that sound actually affects the weather patterns, or that it enables crops to grow, or that it functions as medicine, right? All of those things are off the table once you flatten a kind of expression into just intellectual property, or just music, or just sound, or just a recording, right? All of a sudden you take this ontologically very beautiful landscape and you flatten it into a 2D image, and it just serves one purpose. And so I think that's, the prime argument that I make against this, is that, it's not necessarily that we're anti-cultural appropriation, right? Everybody appropriates culture. That's how we are as humans. What we're trying to say is, look, there's a diversity of ontologies when it comes to the way that we look at sound and music and other types of expression, right? For us, it might look like sound or music. To somebody, it actually is a legal system, or it's a form of medicine. And if we just stick it into a box, then all of a sudden we've eliminated a lot of our possibilities for what this thing can do for us and for other people. Anyway, that's my soapbox. I don't know, Christina, do you have a better way of looking at this than my lawyerly perspective here?
I don't think it's necessarily better, but I mean, I'll just add to that, and it's to echo some of what you said in terms of not thinking of it as a zero-sum game. And I also have conversations with my students as well, as they're preparing to undertake anthropological research. Just this question of it, it sounds like anything we do traditionally as anthropologists is bad. So what are we supposed to do? But that, it's to talk to them about, well, it's not that it's, anything is under threat of being bad. So cultural appropriation, because of the rhetoric that we now do see as being fairly pervasive, there is this idea that to appropriate or to take from a culture is always theft, and it is always exploitative. But even though because of the history of exploitation of people of color, in general, yes, this is what we have seen from appropriation that has been taken by those with power in order to profit from the cultures of people of color. But historically, human beings borrow from each other. That's what we do. We learn from each other, and that this is fine to appropriate or to make use of the cultures of other people can be fine, and it can be good if it is done with respect and without the intent of exploitation. And I think most importantly, with an understanding that there needs to be a relationship or a set of relationships that demonstrate respect and cultural sharing. And so that's what I tell students, that we really do need to begin to think about how can our work be about building relationships and sharing, and also rethinking how we go about sharing the information that we gather. That it can't be that everything that we write about is always going to be right, that we will make mistakes, and where we're always under threat of perhaps misrepresenting, but we can think about, what are ways that we can continue to have an ongoing relationship with the people that we collaborate with for our research to get it more right every single time. If we build a good enough relationship, we can make mistakes, but go back and say, I'm so sorry. You're right. I shouldn't have written it that way. What do you think we should do to move forward so that we can better represent what it was that you were trying to share with me? So I think at the center of that really is relationships, and also just rethinking how it is that we share knowledge with the world. So I think the classic model within academia has been to go and learn stuff, create this expert analysis, and then it's done and final. And if anyone thinks there's anything wrong with it, well, then you get into this debate and conflict about who's right and who's wrong, when really it should be a conversation. And I think thinking more in terms of conversation would be definitely the direction that we need to go, in terms of thinking about the fact that knowledge is malleable, it does change over time, and it can take different forms.
Thank you so much, Christina and Trevor, for like the conversation and discussion, and both of your wonderful talks. We are at time, so thank you for the questions asked. And also one last reminder before wrapping up, to visit bcnm.berkeley.edu and newmedia.academy for more information and or for more information about future talks and the upcoming Indigenous Technologies Summer Workshop.
Thank you, Sierra.
Thanks, Sierra. Thanks, Raphael.